By the time the syrup hit the second pancake, the alarms were already wailing across the orbital station Virell 9. Yarik Foster didn't flinch. He simply tilted the bottle a little more, watching the thick amber stream pool on his breakfast with the focus of a man who had survived worse than an interstellar lecture on glucose intake. "Sir, please, I beg you cease the pour." The voice came from across the cafeteria's shimmering blue partition where a translucent barrier separated human dietary zones from the rest of the multi-species mess hall. Dr. Hylax, Chief Nutritional Officer from the Planetary Consortium of Yulbor, had nearly dropped its data tablet. Its gelatinous frame quivered in horror as it floated closer, 3 ocular stalks locked on the glistening stack. Yarik looked up. "What? The syrup? The extra sugars. You've already exceeded the caloric limit by 427%. It's breakfast," Yarik said without apology, stabbing into the stack with his fork. "You ever tried maple syrup from Vermont? You are destabilizing your internal systems," Hylax cried. "Your pancreas is emitting distress hormones." Yarik chewed slowly, eyes narrowing as he considered the taste. "Tastes fine to me." The station's intercom crackled. "Attention all guests, human caloric intake parameters are under review. Please do not replicate or mimic dietary behavior witnessed in Sector GH. Yarik sighed. "I'm not a hazard," he muttered, then added, "Well, not usually." Hylax was already transmitting a stream of biometric readings to the Central Health AI. Within seconds, a med drone dropped from the ceiling like a hawk. It hovered beside Yarik, blinking red. "Please submit to immediate analysis." Yarik leaned back. "You serious?" The drone extended a scanner toward his wrist. A quick zap and his vitals scrolled across its interface. Elevated blood sugar, obviously. A slight uptick in heart rate. Nothing life-threatening. Diagnostic, minor metabolic overload detected. Recommend hydration and activity. "Sounds like a plan," Yarik said. He stood, his tray clattering slightly. "Thanks for the concern, Doc." Hylax was not appeased. "You were setting a dangerous precedent. The Virell delegation mistook your breakfast for a nutritional supplement and attempted to ingest it raw. One is now undergoing emergency dialysis." Yarik paused. "They drank syrup? They thought it was medicinal tree sap." He blinked. "That's unfortunate." Hylax seemed to swell with anxiety. "You must consider your influence. Your species demonstrates alarming dietary resilience. It is misleading the less durable among us." Before Yarik could respond, a shout echoed from the corridor. "Emergency in the food lab." Yarik bolted into motion, instincts kicking in. The food lab was 2 decks below, and if something had gone wrong with cross-species food sharing again, he'd probably be asked to explain why his people considered peanut butter non-lethal. He arrived just in time to see 2 Varnaxi engineers writhing on the ground, their scales flushed a deep purple. A shattered container of what looked like powdered sugar lay nearby, its contents scattered across the floor. "What happened?" Yarik asked, kneeling beside one of them. A technician answered, "They saw you eating pancakes and thought the white powder was a flavor enhancer." Snorted it. Yarik looked stunned. "That's not even." "They watched you earlier in the week. With cinnamon," the tech said. "That was on toast. Still powder." Yarik rubbed his temples. "I can't be responsible for how aliens interpret breakfast condiments." Within 10 minutes, the Varnaxi were stabilized. But the incident triggered a cascade of dietary restrictions across the station. Signs went up. Human food zones were red-labeled. All sugar-based products required lockdown clearance. The next morning, Yarik walked into the mess to find his pancakes replaced with a compressed soy patty and a side of nutrient paste. He stared at the plate. "This is a hate crime." Hylax floated over, smugly holding a clipboard. "A balanced meal. No added sugars. Approved by the Interspecies Nutrition Committee." Yarik picked up a spoon and poked the paste. It wobbled. "Give me syrup," he said. Denied. He stood, picked up the tray, and walked back to his quarters. He didn't eat the paste. Instead, he opened the drawer under his desk, revealing a small glass bottle he'd hidden weeks ago. The label read, "Gray to dark amber." He poured a tiny amount onto a cracker and took a bite. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him of home. Over the next few days, tensions mounted. Other species began filing formal complaints. The Yulbor, the Virell, even the usually indifferent Hazari each sent documentation citing human dietary recklessness. Yarik was summoned to a tribunal. He wore his cleanest shirt and tried not to look like a man who regularly smuggled syrup. The tribunal consisted of 5 delegates from various species, each with their own nutritionist. Hylax stood at the front, presenting exhibits. Exhibit A, the pancake incident. Exhibit B, cinnamon ingestion observed by 4 separate species. Exhibit C, syrup cracker smuggling. Yarik interrupted. That was in my room. My private quarters. Shared air filtration. Hylax snapped. The scent of maple triggered a feeding frenzy in the lower deck. Yarik sat down heavily. So what happens now? The lead delegate, a tall Atari with bioluminescent stripes, leaned forward. You are being reassigned to the human-only sector on Atropos 4. There, your dietary habits will not endanger others. Yarik's jaw tensed. I've been on Virell 9 for 2 years. I've trained 10 cross-species teams. You're kicking me out over pancakes. Your nutritional behavior is irreconcilable with station harmony. He stood slowly. Fine, but you're all missing the point. It's not about the syrup. It's about understanding each other. You can't just ban what you don't get. The Atari delegate blinked. You poured extra syrup after being warned of caloric overload. Yarik opened his mouth, then closed it. Fair. He was escorted to his quarters to pack. As he zipped up his duffel, he noticed a small envelope under the door. Inside was a note. It read, "Don't let them take your pancakes. D." Attached was a tiny vial of syrup. He smiled. Departure was scheduled for the next day. That night, he sat by the observation deck, watching the stars slide past. He wasn't angry. Just tired. Not of the mission, but of being misunderstood. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He turned. It was Dranara Halley, the station's human compatibility officer. She stepped in, holding a small plate. Don't ask how I got it, she said. Yarik looked down. A single pancake, warm and golden. No syrup. I figured you'd want a clean send-off. He laughed quietly. Thanks. She sat beside him. You know, some of them are starting to come around. Hylax submitted a request for a sugar tolerance trial. Really? Yeah. You may have sparked a shift. Just, maybe next time, smaller portions. He nodded, taking a bite. I'll think about it. Outside, the stars kept moving. And somewhere, beyond the dietary restrictions and tribunal hearings, there was still a universe full of flavor. 2 weeks after the tribunal, Yarik Foster was still on Virell 9. His reassignment had been delayed twice, first by an unexpected ion storm that crippled outbound shuttle traffic, and again when his transfer ship was diverted to assist a diplomatic skirmish near the Vellin border. In the meantime, he'd been moved to an auxiliary habitat ring no one used unless they were in quarantine or exile. The walls hummed unevenly and half the environmental controls were in a dialect only 3 linguists could parse. The first night, the heating unit tried to simulate a tropical rainforest. He woke up soaked in condensation, shirt stuck to his back, a fern sprouting from the floor vent. By the 4th day, he'd stopped asking for maintenance. No one answered the request console. At 0700 local station time, Yarik stepped onto the gravitrack headed toward the observation dome. He carried a thermos heat modified with a miniature heating coil, a spoon wedged through the lid. Inside, oatmeal spiked with a single packet of freeze-dried strawberries he traded 3 water rations for. He reached the dome to find someone already there. A tall, pale-skinned figure stood near the viewport, 6-fingered hands clasped behind its back. The skin shimmered faintly like oil on water, and its posture was military rigid, alert, like it had never relaxed a single tendon voluntarily. Yarik hesitated. The figure turned. Human Foster, it said. Its voice had a clipped rhythm, like syllables were being selected from a shelf and snapped into place. Didn't know anyone else came up here, Yarik said, stepping in. I am Commander Vellin of the Kestrith Accord. I have been assigned to observe your post-tribunal behavior. Yarik blinked. You're my parole officer? I am your cultural liaison. Same thing. Vellin didn't respond. Its gaze lingered on the thermos. You are consuming food not sourced from the central mess. I cooked it in my quarters. That is unauthorized. I used a camping coil and recycled water. It's technically legal. Vellin stepped closer, eyes narrowed slightly. Your species continues to operate within margins not anticipated by the Accord. Yarik unscrewed the lid. The smell of hot oats and artificial berries filled the air. If you're here to monitor, you might as well sit. I do not consume during surveillance. Suit yourself, Yarik said, and took a bite. The next morning, Vellin was already in the dome when Yarik arrived. This time, he brought scrambled eggs. "Are you going to stare at me the whole time?" Yarik asked. "I am studying the psychological impact of gastronomic isolation. Pretty sure that's just called breakfast alone." By the end of the week, Vellin had taken to following Yarik through most of his daily routines. He asked questions constantly about texture preferences, thermal thresholds, digestive variants, and why humans insisted on seasoning things they were already willing to eat. "You understand salt has no nutritional value?" Vellin asked once. "It has flavor," Yarik said. "You are introducing non-essential compounds purely for sensation." "Exactly." Vellin paused, then muttered something in Kestrith under his breath. Yarik didn't catch the full phrasing, but it sounded like a curse. By the second week, Vellin requested a demonstration. "I have submitted a request to the Station Council for a controlled culinary experiment," he said. "Define controlled. You will prepare 3 meals under observation. I will document physiological responses in real time. The food will be consumed by a human only." "So I'm feeding myself?" "Yes." "Under surveillance?" Yarik shrugged. "Fine, but I need access to the hydroponics lab, a heat source, and at least 1 spice rack." Vellin arranged it within 12 hours. Yarik suspected the Kestrith had more pull than they let on. The lab was sterile, brightly lit, and equipped with a workstation designed for chemical synthesis. He pulled ingredients from the communal storage: algae protein, root starch, a tomato hybrid labeled in 5 languages, and a packet of something labeled sour leaf that made the back of his throat tingle just from the scent. He worked quickly, hands moving with confidence. The algae was seared with a mineral oil substitute, the root starch mashed and blended with chopped sour leaf, and the tomato hybrid was diced raw and salted until it bled flavor. Vellin watched, silent. When Yarik plated the food, he sat down and began to eat. Sensors attached to his temple and wrist beeped quietly as they collected data. "Your dopamine levels are rising," Vellin said. "Yeah, that's called enjoying yourself. This is not chemically necessary." "Neither is music," Yarik said. Vellin blinked. "Then why do you persist?" "Because life isn't just about surviving it." The next day, Vellin brought a surprise. "I have acquired a sample of Kestrith root bark. It is used in ceremonial salves but is technically edible by humans." Yarik examined the dark, fibrous strip. It smelled like scorched cinnamon and old paper. "What happens if I eat it?" "You may experience auditory hallucinations and a mild increase in aggression." He took a bite. Vellin lunged forward. "That was not a directive." Yarik chewed slowly. "Tastes like regret." "Spit it out." "I already swallowed." Vellin stared at him as if waiting for combustion. After 2 minutes, nothing happened. Yarik shrugged. "Guess I'm immune." "That is not possible." "Tell that to my stomach." By evening, Yarik felt slightly warmer than usual, but otherwise fine. He spent the night cataloging the root bark's taste and texture, adding notes to a file he labeled Interstellar Spice Index. 3 days later, new orders came through. His reassignment had been cancelled. Instead, he was being transferred to the Intercultural Adaptation Corps, a division notorious for sending humans into unpredictable environments to see what broke first: the situation or the human. Vellin found him packing. "This reassignment was influenced by your recent actions." "Let me guess. They saw the data and decided I was too weird to ignore." "Your resilience under incompatible dietary and environmental conditions is considered statistically significant." Yarik zipped up his field bag. "Where am I going?" "Galeph Ur. Oceanic colony. Atmosphere is high in iodine. Local food sources are inedible to most sentients." He paused. "What do they eat?" "Filtered plankton and thermal fungi." "Well, that sounds horrifying." "You leave at station dusk." Yarik slung the bag over his shoulder. "You coming?" "I have filed for reassignment. I intend to study your integration firsthand." "You volunteered?" "I find your species frustrating, but educational." He grinned. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me all month." They boarded the transport an hour later. Yarik settled into a crash couch, eyes scanning the manifest. Only 2 other humans. The rest were a jumble of aquatic adapted species and 1 insectoid diplomat wrapped in a humidity shroud. Vellin took the seat beside him. "You realize," Vellin said, "if you attempt to ingest local fauna without clearance, I am mandated to intervene." I'll behave, Yarik said. Probably. The lights dimmed. The hull rumbled as the shuttle detached. Vellin tapped the tablet embedded in the armrest. There is a file here titled Human Culinary Deviance, an expanding catalog. It has 5 annexes. I'm honored, Yarik said. You should not be. As they accelerated toward Galeph Ur, Yarik leaned back and closed his eyes. Somewhere ahead, there were new things to taste, strange ingredients to misunderstand, and a whole ocean of rules waiting to be bent. He couldn't wait. The air on Galeph Ur tasted faintly of seaweed and rusted iron. Yarik stepped off the landing ramp, boots sinking half an inch into the damp polymer mesh that covered every surface of the arrival platform. The ocean was visible in all directions, an endless field of dark, heaving water broken only by the scattered silver domes of the colony. Wind howled across the landing site, pushing salt spray into the seams of his jacket. This place has atmosphere, he muttered, squinting against the gusts. Atmosphere is the correct term, Vellin replied, already adjusting the filtration nodes embedded along his neck. It is largely composed of inert gases and trace iodine vapor. It will corrode most unshielded optics in under 6 days. A squat, crab-legged loader bot clattered past them, dragging a crate the size of a small shuttle. A cluster of translucent skinned locals, long-limbed and gilled, moved with fluid precision around the crates, never lifting their feet, just gliding. None of them looked in Yarik's direction. A woman in a functional gray coat approached. Her left eye was a mechanical lens with a ripple of blue light cycling through it. You're the human? She asked, pulling a hood closer around her jawline. That's me. Dr. Marin Voss. Colonial Intake. You'll be with the Adaptive Field Unit. They're down 2 staff and 1 cook. She turned and walked without waiting. Yarik followed, adjusting the strap on his duffel. Vellin kept pace silently, his boots making no noise on the slick mesh. Marin led them across a series of gangways suspended above pulsing seawater. Creatures thrashed below the surface long, eel-shaped things with bioluminescent spines. One launched upward, jaws wide, then fell back with a splash. No swimming, she said without turning around. Wasn't planning on it, Yarik muttered. The adaptive field unit was housed in a dome perched on a floating platform tethered to the colony's central station. Inside, lights flickered under a slick of condensation. The air was warmer than he'd expected and smelled faintly of vinegar and burnt kelp. Marin gestured to a storage locker. Gear's there. Orientation briefing starts in 15 minutes. Don't eat anything that isn't vacuum sealed. That includes things that look like bread. She left without another word. Yarik opened the locker. Inside was a damp uniform, a sealed meal pack labeled emergency ration fungal base, and a slim data slate. He peeled off his travel jacket and pulled on the colony gear. It clung to his back like a particularly judgmental wetsuit. 15 minutes later, he sat in a narrow room with 5 others. 2 humans, a Hazari with iridescent plates, and something that resembled a bipedal cuttlefish with a respirator unit grafted to its side. A holoscreen blinked on. Welcome to Galeph Ur, said a voice with bureaucratic enthusiasm. As part of the adaptive field unit, you'll be conducting environmental compatibility trials, food source viability studies, and emergency response drills. Please remember, ingestion of native biota is strictly prohibited unless cleared by bioassay. The last incident resulted in severe neural dissociation. Yarik leaned over to the woman beside him. She had a shaved head and a tattoo of a planetary ring system trailing down her neck. Neural dissociation? Guy tried to eat a Tide blister. Spent 4 hours trying to converse with his own spleen. That's a hard no then. She grinned. Name's Isha. Yarik. I'm the new cook, apparently. Lucky us. The first assignment came 3 hours later. A buoy had gone offline 3 clicks from the main dome. The field team was dispatched to investigate, split into pairs. Yarik was assigned to Isha. Vellin, despite not being on the unit roster, followed without comment. The transport skiff was little more than a floating crate with steering controls. As they skimmed over the waves, Yarik caught sight of something massive gliding beneath them, shadowy and slow, with fins the size of buildings. Isha tapped her scanner. Don't look down too long. They like eye contact. The buoy was half submerged when they reached it. One of its stabilizers had been sheared clean off. Yarik climbed down onto its side, balancing awkwardly as the platform bobbed. This thing got hit or chewed? Either way, it's offline. We'll need to reinitialize the power core manually. Define manually. Open that hatch and hope nothing hisses. Yarik pried the panel open. Steam hissed out, not hostile, just pressure release. Inside, a bundle of corroded cables glistened wetly. He reached in with an insulated glove. You know this kind of tech? Isha asked. Not really, but I dated someone who fixed weather drones on Europa. She taught me a few tricks. Useful X. She was a nightmare personally. Great with wires though. He twisted a coupling, reset the fuse, and the buoy blinked back to life with a deep hum. Power indicators pulsed green. Isha raised an impressed eyebrow. Not bad. Yarik grinned. Guess pancakes aren't my only skill. They returned to the dome soaked and smelling like brine. Marin was waiting, arms crossed. Good work on the buoy. But we've got another issue. The local algae cultures are mutating. We need a nutrient profile before they overtake the irrigation lines. I thought eating algae was banned, Yarik said. It is. But we need to know why it's growing like this. An hour later, he stood in the hydroponics bay, staring at a wall of pulsing green masses. The algae had developed a strange lattice structure like it was trying to mimic bone. He scraped a sample into a dish and ran it through the analyzer. The screen displayed a compound chain with a known neurotoxin at the base. But there was something else, an amino acid sequence that looked familiar. He cross-referenced it and frowned. This is beef protein. Marin looked over his shoulder. What? This strain's mimicking bovine muscle tissue. Someone's been dumping synthetic meat residue into the growth tanks. That's not possible. I'm telling you, it's trying to grow steak. Vellin stepped forward. You are implying the algae is adapting to human food sources. Not just adapting, copying. Badly. Marin pinched the bridge of her nose. We'll need to incinerate the whole batch. And isolate the filtration system. Yarik nodded. I'll help. But I need kitchen access. For what? I want to see what happens when I cook it. An hour later, in the colony's kitchen bay, he had a pan heated and a chunk of the algae protein sizzling with a drop of oil. It browned like meat. The smell was off-metallic and sweet, but not unbearable. He plated a small piece, cut it, and held it up. I'm not eating that, Isha said behind him. Didn't ask you to. Vellin stepped forward. I will log the effects. Yarik took a bite. It was chewy, rubbery, and faintly electric. His tongue tingled. A low buzz pulsed behind his eyes. He set the fork down. How do you feel? Vellin asked. Like I licked a battery. But I'm fine. He waited 10 minutes. No hallucinations. No cardiac spikes. Just a mild warmth in his gut and the unsettling realization that his body had once again tolerated something that should not be food. Marin returned with a med scanner. She ran it over him, frowning. No toxic markers. Vitals stable. You're not normal. I get that a lot. The algae was catalogued and quarantined. The filtration system was cleared. The colony filed a report to the Accord's research division, labeling the incident as unintended cross-species culinary mimicry. Yarik returned to his quarters after midnight, exhausted. The dome creaked gently in the wind. He sat on the edge of his bunk, pulled off his boots, and opened a ration bar. Tasted like plastic and regret, but it was safe. Vellin stood in the doorway. You could have died. Probably. You ate synthetic algae mimicking terrestrial livestock. Yeah. And you intend to keep doing things like that? Yarik leaned back, chewing. If it helps people not die later, then yeah. Vellin stared for a moment, then nodded once. You were illogical, but useful. Yarik grinned. You're not bad yourself. The next morning, he received a message from Central Command. Field adaptation successful. Human integration complete. No further observation required. He stared at the message, then deleted it. Outside, the ocean kept moving. The colony lights flickered against the fog. And somewhere in the lab freezer, the algae steak waited for further testing. Yarik pulled on his boots. Breakfast wasn't going to make itself.